Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we initiate our third of 5 programs on whistleblowers. We have been discussing this extraordinary phenomenon, actually, of people deeply embedded in either a government or a corporation that is doing all kinds of bad things, but is able to do it covertly. And then occasionally there's a closet patriot that emerges who is a person of real integrity that challenges this from the inside. And that is what we are contemplating this week. Yesterday, we looked at what's going on in China. And today we want to talk about whistleblowers in the UFO movement over the last 75 years. And we also want to take note of Daniel Ellsberg. And so we'll be talking with Danny Sheehan in a moment, who is going to join us. I want to just begin by saying, though, that I found out something very interesting about the building that I'm sitting in right now. Is the office of the New Paradigm Institute here in Washington, D.C., which is inside the federal enclave, the federal buildings between the Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol building, with the Washington Monument in the middle, and the White House and the Supreme Court and the Senate and House office buildings and the Smithsonian museums and so forth and so on. Turns out that this building, which right now is literally across the street from the U.S. Capitol, was originally the actual site of the first Capitol building of the United States, built after the Revolutionary War. If you remember, in 1976, the United States went to war against the British, and then gained independence by 1783. By 1789, the Constitution was passed, and they built a little Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And then the British and the Americans went to war in 1812. And if you remember your history, the British came down and burned down Washington and burned down the Capitol building. So this building was burnt by the British during the war. And then it was vacant for many years. And then it was rebuilt. And during the Civil War, the building on this site was used as a prison for Confederate soldiers that had been captured by the Union Army in the course of the conflict between 1861 and 1865. And then it was derelict for many years. And then it was bought by the United Methodist Church about 100 years ago, largely because they were active against prohibition and the sale of liquor in the United States during the 1920s. And they built this building, which is now called the United Methodist Building, and it's open for many religious denominations like the United Church of Christ, or the National Council of Churches, or the World Council of Churches. And the New Paradigm Institute is in Suite 405 on the 4th floor. So I just thought people would be interested in a little bit of history as we unfold here. And Georg, I don't know whether Danny has joined or not. He's been traveling And so I'll continue here to provide introductory comments while we're waiting for Danny to join. And we wanted to start today with a narrative by Danny, who was very intimately involved back in the 1960s with the case of Daniel Ellsberg, who I think was really one of the original whistleblowers in the higher reaches of the Pentagon. He was a brilliant analyst and was given a top secret security clearance literally across the board in the Pentagon where he worked, and then began to realize that what the government was doing was essentially lying to the American people and to the world about the reality of what was actually happening. And he got so concerned about that he began to Xerox, back in those days, some of the critical classified documents that showed incontrovertibly that, in fact, what the U.S. government was saying to the American public was a total deception, including, as I mentioned a few days ago, the Gulf of Tonkin incident in July of 1964, where the United States, in complete violation of international law, had sent warships inside the territorial waters of North Vietnam intentionally as a provocation, was arming and providing artillery support for the cadres of the South Vietnamese army that the U.S. was supporting for raids into North Vietnam. And I believe it was in July 30th or 31st of 1964, the North Vietnamese launched some artillery shells and damaged a warehouse and one of the ships, and that began the justification on the part of the United States, which lied to the American public and said that it was a massive assault on U.S. Military personnel and warships who were in international waters, completely neutral and not doing anything to provoke anything. So this was an unprovoked invasion. Remember that from Ukraine? Remember that from what's going on in Palestine with Hamas? It's always the same rhetoric. It's an unprovoked invasion or an unprovoked attack by a terrorist group. And that is what Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was then president of the United States, used to justify to the Congress, who voted almost unanimously, with very, very few exceptions, to provide the next level of military aid to support the democratic forces in Vietnam, to protect democracy and Western civilization against the terrorists coming in from the North, who were going to instill communism and take over the known world. And that generated the Vietnam War. And in the middle of it, Daniel Ellsberg, then a young man, knowing that if he was convicted by a court for treason, which is what his actions really were considered. Think of Edward Snowden. Think of other whistleblowers from the military who have gone to the press. Many of them have gone to jail. And in Edward Snowden's case, he had to escape the United States and ended up in Russia, where the Russians gave him asylum. Think of Julian Assange from Australia, who's now languishing near death in a British prison, waiting to be extradited to the United States. So it's not always the case that a whistleblower meets success in what it is that they're seeking to achieve. In this case, Daniel Ellsberg sent the Pentagon Papers, as they came to be called, to the New York Times and to the Washington Post. And they had the good sense and patriotic obligation to begin to publish what they had received. And Daniel P. Sheehan, who was then working for the law firm Cahill Gordon in New York City, was assigned the case as a young lawyer who, in a series of law cases, won the case that set the precedent for whistleblowers. That in fact, if someone in the government or in a corporation comes to find out and can provide evidence of illegalities, there's a constitutional protection. And that is what was the famous Pentagon Papers case that went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And in the end, the New York Times and the Washington Post were acquitted, and Daniel Ellsberg, obviously he had to resign from the Pentagon, but he did not go to prison. And so the friendship that he had with Danny Sheehan was steadfast until just a month ago or two. Daniel Ellsberg, at the age of 93, succumbed to the passage of time and went to the other side and his reward. And if you remember, Dan Ellsberg was on Humanity Rising in the spring, and he came on to Humanity Rising the day after he was informed by his doctor that he had pancreatic cancer that was uncurable, and that he had about 6 months to live. And watching Dan Ellsberg in those final 6 months, and watching the dignity and the magnanimity with which he spoke, his final will and testament, his concern about nuclear weapons, to which he had dedicated his entire life. Even though he became famous because he was involved in the Pentagon Papers around the Vietnam War, it was actually what he learned in the Pentagon about the extraordinary, devastating power of nuclear weapons, and realized that many people, even in the military, to say nothing about the President of the United States or the Congress or the people that were in on the decision-making processes, had really no idea about what nuclear war really means and the devastating consequence of igniting nuclear exchanges in our world. And you'll remember that it was just a few years previous to Dan Ellsberg releasing the Pentagon Papers in 1968, that in 1962 we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States almost went to thermonuclear war against the Russians over the fact that the Russians had placed in Cuba nuclear weapons, and at the request of Fidel Castro, after the United States had placed nuclear weapons in Germany and the UK and France, and then they placed nuclear weapons right in Turkey, right on the Russian border. So in response to that, Nikita Khrushchev, the general secretary of the Communist Party in what was then the Soviet Union, worked out a deal with Fidel Castro, who had just in 1960 overthrown the US-backed regime of Batista, which was basically a mafia regime in Castro that had made a deal with the the pineapple companies and the banana companies and the coffee companies to have Cuba be an export platform for US corporations. And so the US corporations, once Fidel Castro seized power, he nationalized all of those corporations and said that the pineapples and the bananas and the coffee actually belonged to the Cuban people. And the United States was so incensed that in the late stages of the Eisenhower administration in 1960, they launched plans to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. And as you may remember from your history, it was when John Kennedy became president in January 1961 that, in fact, the invasion, the so-called Bay of Pigs invasion, was launched right when he was becoming president. And it was a complete failure because it turns out that the Cuban people supported Fidel Castro and went to war against the invaders, and it ended up in a complete fiasco. And in the aftermath of that, then Fidel said to the Russians, "We need nuclear weapons in Cuba as a deterrent against the United States." Well, when the United States realized in the spring of 1962, the U-2 flights over Cuba, the satellite, the surveillance, that in fact the Russians were building a nuclear-capable missile launching complex, the U.S. just went apoplectic. The thought that the Russians would do to the United States what the United States was doing to the Russians was just unconscionable, and a violation of the Monroe Doctrine that had been enunciated by President Monroe in 1823, stating that no foreign power was allowed anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, not in Canada, not in Mexico, not in Central America, not in Latin America, all the way down to Argentina, to deploy military troops or have a military alliance, that the entire Western Hemisphere was the domain of US control and suzerainty. So when the Russians did that in 1962, the combined consensus, which is kind of hard to believe now, the combined consensus of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by General Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the Air Force, supported by the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State recommended to President Kennedy that they go to a full-bore intercontinental ballistic nuclear attack against the Soviet Union. And that attack was designed to take out 160 cities across Russia. And the estimates of the Air Force and the Pentagon is that it would leave probably upwards of 60 to 80 million people dead. And when President Kennedy was told this information, he was aghast. And working with his brother, Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General of the United States at that time, the two of them began to engage in secret negotiations, which they kept secret from their own cabinet, to try to figure out a peaceful resolution of this crisis. But the momentum toward war, nuclear war, was inexorable. And so at a minimum, what Kennedy did, as you remember from your history, is order a blockade, surrounded Cuba with warships as the Russians were bringing the final missiles into Cuba. And the warships stopped. And one of the things that was happening, and the reason why they stopped, is that Kennedy had sent a message to Khrushchev saying there's got to be a way that we can solve this. And in fact, they reached an agreement that if the United States would withdraw troops from Turkey and the nuclear warheads from Turkey, the Russians would withdraw their nuclear weapons and their troops from Cuba. But there was so much pressure to go to war with Russia, nuclear war, that the agreement was that the Russians would withdraw their nuclear weapons from Cuba immediately. And 6 months later, the Americans, after the crisis had died down, would secretly withdraw their weapons from Turkey. That was the level of pressure against President Kennedy to go to war. And you may know that he paid a price for this, because the General LeMay in the Pentagon, in the Air Force, and the powers that be in the Air Force, including the powers that be in the CIA, who felt that Kennedy wasn't man enough to go to nuclear war. That was the cabal working with the Cuban mafia groups in Florida that put together the assassination 2 years later, 1 year later, in November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, that assassinated the president and then brought in Lyndon Baines Johnson. And one of the first acts that Johnson did as president was move forward in Vietnam with the pretext of the Gulf of Tonkin. And Dan Ellsberg was in the Pentagon, privy to all the intelligence information while all this was going on. And that is the backstory of Ellsberg, and one of the great whistleblowers of our time. And so we wanted to commemorate that. It looks like Danny is not joining us. I don't know whether there were technical difficulties or what. We'll have him on at a different time. But I want to now, since
Jim, I think people are very curious to hear more about your job in Washington, what you're doing, what you're encountering.
Yeah, good. I was just going to turn to that. Thank you, Georg. One of the things that Danny also did was he became involved beginning in 1977 with the UFO issue. And he was the general counsel to John Mack, who was the head of psychiatry at Harvard, who was asked by the Pentagon to analyze a number of people who said that they had UFO experiences, because the Pentagon was asserting that they were crazy, that they were psychologically deranged in one way or another. And so John Mack called Danny, who by then was quite famous as a litigator who never lost cases, given his extraordinary intelligence that he possesses and his capacity in a courtroom. And Harvard University had a tribunal, and they hauled John Mack up and told him that it was an embarrassment to Harvard University that he was, taking on these cases. And his assertion as a psychiatrist is that there was nothing wrong with any of the people that he was interviewing and analyzing, that they were very sane. And he got involved particularly with those people who asserted that they had experienced abductions. And he wrote a whole book on abductions, John Mack did. And beginning in that stage, also with President Carter, who was denied access to the UFO information by the head of the CIA at that time in 1977, who was George Bush Sr. President Carter had seen UFOs while he was a farmer. He had a peanut farm in the state of Georgia, and he'd seen UFOs. So one of the first things he did when he became president, he called the CIA and said, "I want all the information on the UFO matter." And the head of the CIA, George Bush Sr., said, "No, you don't have a need to know." So President Carter, by executive order, asked the Library of Congress to start a study on the UFO phenomenon outside the jurisdiction of the CIA. And Danny became involved in this. What led to the present moment is that in 2012, if I remember correctly, the Pentagon established an office that was headed by a gentleman named Lou Alessandro, who was a top intelligence official, complete security clearance, to find out information on the UFO issue. So as a loyal military man, Lou Alessandro began to look for information, and what he began to discover is that as he requested certain pieces of information, he was being told that he, like the CIA told President Carter, he didn't have a right to know. And he became puzzled, because he was the guy who was supposed to be in a position to know, and he was being denied information. He also realized that when he would bring some evidence that he was able to gain to certain officials in the Pentagon and the intelligence community more broadly, they showed no interest in finding out any more about the information. And he began to realize that, wait a minute here, there's something wrong with this picture. And in particular, you'll remember the incident in 1967 at the Malmstrom base in Montana, where they had a cluster of nuclear missile silos, Minutemen missile silos that carried, hundreds of kilotons of nuclear material, and they were on hair trigger alert to attack the Soviet Union, at a split second notice. And the head of the group was a Lieutenant Robert Salas, and he has given evidence and tells the story that, one day he was notified urgently by the people in the silos that who had monitors, that there were UFOs hovering over the complex of nuclear weapons, and that they thought that they didn't know what they were, but they thought they were close enough to break through the perimeter protecting the nuclear missiles. And so Salas said, well, I don't know what they are. See if you can find out what they are, but under no circumstances are you to allow anybody to penetrate the perimeter. And then the call came a few minutes later, and the people in the missile silos were apoplectic, and they were saying, "You got to do something because they're shutting down the missile silos." And so there was a lot of confusion, and they didn't know what to do. But the UFOs had shut down simultaneously 10 independently organized nuclear weapons missile silos so that they couldn't work. And then the UFOs flew away. No one compromised the perimeter of the base. They did it apparently from the UFO, and that it was a shocking experience. And Salas reported it immediately to the Pentagon and to the powers that be. And the Air Force and the Pentagon acted as if nothing had happened, and ordered Salas and the various people that were involved in the incidents not to say anything under any circumstances to anybody what had happened. And when Lou Alessandro began to realize that in an incident that should have alerted the entire national security apparatus of the entire military and the intelligence, but nobody was doing anything. And in fact, they indicated to him that they didn't want to know about it. He said, this is a compromise of national security. And he became a whistleblower. He decided that, like Ellsberg in the 1960s, he needed to do something to alert somebody that there's something off here. And that's when he called Danny Sheehan and retained Danny as his general counsel. And to make a long story very short, they met with the inspector generals and the head of intelligence for the Pentagon, and they did not receive any satisfaction. So finally, Lou Alessandro resigned. And working with Chris Mellon, who was previously the head of intelligence for the Pentagon, they went to the New York Times, just like Ellsberg did. And they turned over videos of military pilots in military aircraft who had taken videos of these unidentified flying objects, or what are now being called UAPs, the unidentified anomalous phenomena. And they gave it to the New York Times. And they happened to get some alert investigative reporters. And I think it was on December 17th, 2017, for the first time in history, like the New York Times had done when it broke the news of the Pentagon Papers. The New York Times, on a front page edition, released information stating categorically that officials inside the U.S. government had incontrovertible evidence of UFOs. And so Lou Alessandro, instantly became, like Ellsberg, an international celebrity and was all over the news and so forth. And Danny was in and through the entire process. But that instance where the New York Times published the information triggered then what is now taking place in the U.S. Congress today. And the reason why I'm here in Washington, because the intelligence community became alerted. The Congress also became alerted to the fact that after 75 years of UFO-related investigations, the Congress didn't know anything. Members of the executive branch, including the President of the United States, were being kept out of the loop. So the question is, who is in the loop? Who has the information? And why doesn't the U.S. Congress, the government of the United States, have access to information, the implications of which are cosmological? This isn't just like information about chemical or biological weapons or nuclear weapons or, what China's doing in the South China Sea, which really don't make that much difference. This is information about the reality that we are being visited by extraterrestrial civilizations from other galaxies. That's an extraordinary piece of information. And the U.S. Congress and most of the U.S. government is completely out of the loop. So what began to happen at its most, I would say, abstract, is one of the three branches of government, which according to the Supreme Court, if you have to choose between the legislative and the judicial and the executive branch, it's the legislative branch of the government, which is the government. They began a process of asserting that the information that's out there belongs to the U.S. government, and that the U.S. Congress is beginning a series of legislative enactments to, in the first instance, in December of 2022, 1 year ago, next month, they set up an all-domain anomalous resource office, ARROW, that was to be the recipient of all information from, I think, 37 intelligence agencies across the entire federal government, contracting corporations, any other organ of government, that they all had to begin the process of turning over information to the U.S. Congress. It was being organized by the intelligence committees of the Senate and the House, the Government Operations Committee of the Senate and the House. And it was a completely bipartisan consensus, because this wasn't ideological. This was institutional. This was about the U.S. Congress, whether you're an extreme right or you're extreme left, taking a position that it had the right to know what's going on. And it was that process initiated by the New York Times report on December 17th, 2017, that led finally to this legislation last year. Then Senator Schumer, the majority leader of the Senate, and Senator Rubio, who is the head of the Intelligence Committee of the Senate, drafted legislation for the next and final step that was embedded in the defense authorization bill as the Arrow office was in 2022 to establish a 9-person committee that would oversee all the information and the disclosure into the public domain. And this is why we're working here in Washington right now. The legislation, which is right now in reconciliation between the Senate and House Armed Services Committees, which are the official sponsors of the Defense Authorization Acts each year, are now reconciling the Senate bill, which calls for this 9-person committee to be set up, nominated by the president. And it happens that our office is involved in actually making recommendations as to who these people should be. And then the Senate ratifies them. And then they have what is called a controlled disclosure plan over 7 years, commencing on January 1, 2024 through 2030 for gathering this information. And there's a whole process that is in place if this legislation finally passes, so that any information before 1998 has to be sent over and eventually disclosed, unless for some reason the president wants to postpone. So the president has final prerogative over this process. And the various agencies and the contracting corporations have the right for any evidence since 1998 to be postponed. So that's what's happening, but it's all being done by the right of eminent domain. Again, remembering that the Congress now is trying to assert its right to have this information. And that's the process that we're involved in. Now comes the second whistleblower. On July 26th, several months ago, July 26, 2023, the House Intelligence Committee held hearings. And one of the people at the hearing was a man named David Grush, who was the one that replaced Lou Alessandro in this UAP office in the Pentagon. And like Lou Alessandro, realized that he was not being given the information, that the people that should know didn't know, and that there didn't seem to be any concern over issues that would and should trigger acute national security interest. And to give you a measure, just think of the Chinese weather balloons. There you had these balloons from China, way up, thousands of feet above the surface of the earth, floating across the United States. And there was like this major media frenzy and international crisis until finally they were shot down. But around UFOs, nothing happens. Why? So David Grush, like Lou Alessandro, decided to become a whistleblower. And he wrote a letter, and he called Danny. And Danny, in the end, was too busy with other things and recommended that he take another lawyer, but Danny was involved in it. Went to the Inspector General of the Pentagon and reported that this is what's happening. And then he gave a very important news interview with Courtwright, a journalist out of Australia, where he just laid out even more startling information that the US government is in possession not of one, but a dozen different unidentified flying objects that have been retrieved in different places around the world that come from off planet. They are not human technology. And that it has in its possession multiple, some assert scores of alien bodies, non-human intelligences that have either been killed in the course of either the crashes like in Roswell in 1947 in New Mexico, and there's apparently one that either was or continues to be alive that they captured and put in captivity. So this is according to David Grush. And if you've looked at the hearing on July 26th, which I urge everybody to do, there were other people from the military who stated categorically that there is multiple occasions in which fighter aircraft pilots have tracked and videoed and put on the radar craft that have extraordinary capacities to move from 80,000 feet up in the air to sea level in less than a second, which can go from air to sea without losing momentum and can travel in the oceans, under the oceans at 300 miles an hour, that appear to defy any known laws of gravity or thermodynamics known to human technology, and can be going at thousands of miles an hour and do a U-turn, and can stop, go up, down, and appear to have the capacity to know when US military personnel are even thinking of pulling the trigger and attacking them, because they just disappear. They just disappear and can go into one dimension into another without any apparent problem. And so you have an extraordinary phenomenon going on that the US government has been keeping completely secret, in many cases from the government itself, while the group that's controlling this information have been retrieving this, coordinating with major defense contractors like Raytheon, like Grumman, like Lockheed Martin, like Boeing, that are the major military contractors of our time, to reverse engineer whatever technology that the US government can figure out and use it to enhance US military capacity as it seeks, as we've discussed, to establish what it calls full spectrum dominance over the entire planet, including out in space. And that's why there's war against Russia, war against China, The United States is currently seeking full spectrum dominance, and a key piece of that strategy is to reverse engineer the technology that's been retrieved from the UFOs. Simultaneously, it has had an orchestrated campaign since almost immediately after the Second World War to cover it up, to lie about it, and further, to have a orchestrated campaign to trivialize it, to marginalize anybody who reports UFOs, and to get them considered crazy. So if you talk to anybody about UFOs, people think, oh yeah, you're just some guy in a trailer park from Arizona somewhere who sees things at night. That's been a carefully cultivated campaign by the CIA for the last 75 years. And in the middle of all that, the evidence of UFOs on Earth has gotten so enormous. Whistleblowers are now bringing out the information. The Congress is now wanting in on that, that the cat is now out of the bag. That's basically what's happened. And what we're in Washington doing right now is trying to ensure that the bill, the Schumer Amendment, remains essentially intact as the National Defense Authorization Act is finally put together and passed over the next 4 to 6 weeks. And so that, in a nutshell, is what I'm doing here, and the general domain that we were hoping to cover today. So I haven't been looking at the chats. I see that there's been lots and lots of questions, see if I can find some. Or Georg, if you've got some of the salient ones, you can just let me know what they are. But if there's anything that anybody wants to know, you could put it in the chat. Barbo Estrandater is asking about all the other people around the world that claim they have seen UFOs. And are you saying that all other governments are also keeping this a secret? Good question. The prevailing consensus of people around the world, interestingly, if you look at a graph, probably at least 50–60% of all the UFO sightings have been happening in the United States, triggered by the Trinity test on July 16th, 1945, where we ignited the first nuclear device that then 3 weeks later we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That really triggered the UFO phenomenon in a modern sense. And then there's been maybe another 20% have been in Europe. There have been a lot in Europe. And then the rest of the world has about 20% of the sightings, just to give a sense of the distribution, the global distribution of UFO sightings. And as you know, there's different categories. Category 1 is when you see it. Category 2, close encounters of the second kind, is sort of when they land and leave physical evidence. Close encounters of the third kind is when there's some kind of communication back and forth. And close encounters of the fourth kind is when there's some kind of experienced abduction. And then close encounters of the fifth kind are what we're interested in, is how do humans begin to cultivate a capacity to engage with the ETs, because it's clear that we can do so. And one of the extraordinary data points on this communication is that overwhelmingly what the extraterrestrial intelligences are telling us is that we are killing each other, we're killing the planet, and we've really become a virus in the planetary ecology, and we've got to stop. Particularly, we need to stop the nuclear weapons. And I mentioned what happened in 1967 with the Minuteman missile sites in Montana. It's happened in the Soviet Union multiple times. It's happened in other missile silos in the United States multiple times. So there's clearly the extraterrestrials, which appear to be sort of observing us somewhat in a fact-finding modality, but they're very concerned and have been communicating to people all over the world that we need to get it together as a human race, unite as a single human family, come into synergy with the larger planetary ecology. And only then will we be ready for the kind of contact with the extraterrestrial civilizations that they're waiting for us to have. But we need to go through a maturational catalyst of higher consciousness. And that's what Humanity Rising is about. That's what the New Paradigm Institute is about. You know, we're wanting to somehow get human beings to stop killing each other en masse in Ukraine, in Gaza, in the Congo, in Tibet, all over the world. You see violence of every conceivable kind. Our species seems incapable of the kind of global cooperation that is so obviously imperative. And so the ETs are basically warning us in one way over the world, repeatedly over the last 75 years, to stop the violence and come together in radical collaboration. That's what they're saying. And so I guess to see that someone's dad was at Malmstrom Air Force Base. Could they come on with you? Absolutely. If there's someone there that we could bring on that was actually there, that would be an incredible thing to have. But those are just some of the factors that are there. So if there's any other questions that anyone have, if not, we'll bring this session to a close. But we're in a very exciting time, and we're developing a training program that we're going to launch hopefully over the next couple of months between the New Paradigm Institute and Ubiquity University that will have two parts. One, which will be developed by New Paradigm Institute, which will be the history, the politics, the law, what you can do politically to contact your congressional representative, wherever you are around the world, your government agency, to stop keeping this information secret. Because in fact, the US government, wherever these ETs have been sighted around the world, has immediately gone there. With obviously the exception of Russia or China, and has insisted that the other governments keep this completely secret. So it may well be that the Russians and the Chinese are also doing the same thing as the Americans, and that is trying to reverse engineer the technology that they've captured for military purposes. And that's the point. This is this inflection point that we're at. To the question of Charles Bensiger, yes, absolutely. That's the whole point that we need with disclosure. We've got to stop this policy formation of limiting the ET technology just to building more weapons. We've got to release it to public domain, because the energy and the technology could give humanity unlimited energy for free, unlimited capacity to travel to other star systems in an instantaneous blink of an eye. All that is possible. The ETs have given us that technology, and it's being secreted away by the military-industrial complex to build better weapons, to kill people. And the ETs are just watching us doing it and are just aghast that we have no capacity for higher consciousness. I mean, Stephen Greer in the Disclosure Project has got a beautiful documentary on the technologies that are apparently there through the ET craft and capacities that, if released into the public domain, would radically liberate humanity to unlimited technology and harmony with galactic and natural systems. We don't need fossil fuels. We don't need to be igniting climate change everywhere around the world, releasing massive amounts of methane into the atmosphere, as we are currently doing. But the information needs to get out, and that's what we need to do. So we have this training program to talk about the technologies that in a concrete political way. And then what Ubiquity will bring to this certification program is the spiritual development, the personal development. How do we refine our intuitive and extrasensory perceptions so that we can activate our eighth chakra, which, as you know, is above the head and is sort of the antenna for the human being to the galaxy. We're all walking around with antennas, except we don't know it. Well, what if we really learned the mechanisms of the chakras and how we can use our chakras and our antenna to engage in mental telepathy with the extraterrestrials? That's possible. People do it all the time. And so we're gathering at Ubiquity the people who know how to do this, because we believe
Linda White is available if you invite her.
Oh, okay. Linda, let's get Linda on. And then Linda White.
I did it, Jim. She's joining as panelist.
Oh, cool. Thank you. So and Linda actually, with a colleague, you were there, Linda. Linda has actually been involved in this issue, and she's one of our faculty on ET trauma. And she was on Humanity Rising, as you may recall, several weeks ago, talking about it. But Linda, I welcome you to make any comment you would like to make on anything that I've said or anything that you would like to add.
Well, I tell you, Jim, what's most alive for me is you're making my dissertation totally obsolete. These are all the threads that I've been weaving together. And, I grew up, on Malmstrom Air Force Base, and my dad was a navigator of B-52 bombers, and he was a missile launch commander. He was in the same silo as Captain Salas, a year and a half before. We left December of 65, and the event was, March of 67. And then it gets even more mysterious. I mean, for the next 3 years, I've really, the dissertation is my life story of trying to make sense of things that I couldn't talk about because it was so buried in conspiracy. And so I had to be really selective as to who I talked to because people would think I was crazy. So it's not just the UFO, it's the whole, and then what I found out in my dissertation research, which I didn't know, I mean, you're going to love all the details in my dissertation, I think, because there's so many
sure
that I didn't realize. Like when we left Montana, it was with the understanding my father was deploying to Vietnam, but he never went to Vietnam. And then I've learned in the research that I've done that he began his career with the Office of Special Investigations in the beginning and the end. And Richard Doughty, who's very well known as, in the UFO community, was with that organization. So what I've been trying to figure out is how this, and then my uncle disappeared when I was a child. And in my dissertation research, he surfaced. I mean, talk about timeless wisdom. He surfaced and he had gone dark with the CIA, and it gets even more intriguing. So these, and I really highly recommend this book to anyone who's interested in this topic. I'm in the middle of reading it now. It's called One Nation Under Blackmail, and it weaves all of these in. But everything that you just shared today, when Carter became president and Bush wanted to continue with the CIA, and Carter said no. And see, this is where my fear, this is my trauma from this. And what I'm, writing about is the moral injury of the 75-year truth embargo. Because even now, I mean, I've dedicated my life to this. And even now, what I'm going to say, I hesitate, but after Carter refused George Bush and the CIA, there was a group, there has been a private CIA that formed. And that, I think, is really what is the underbelly of a lot of this. And somebody had asked a question, which I just loved, they said, what difference is legislation going to make? And I think what, the legislation with these, hidden, and I think what it's going to do is bring all of this out to the surface. But I will share this one little piece, and this is I'm giving away the punchline of my dissertation, but what I want to say is the timeless wisdom, when we really, with the consciousness that we're bringing to this, it's all going to come together. And so the example I can give is, I don't know where I got this article, but it is from 1966. It's got the CIA stamp on it in 60, I think it was 72, it was released. And it was when the Litton Company Corporation, an aerospace corporation, there was concern about them all coming together as a conglomeration. And that was right at the apex of all of this, when aerospace, everything started to converge at that time. And that is what you and Danny are going in and starting to unravel. So that's kind of like the apex of it. And now you're coming in from the outside. But again, it's by bringing awareness. And the most important thing that I want to say is we have got to stop treating people like they're crazy when they speak their deep inner truth. I don't care what it is. This is why I've been a therapist for 30 years. And it's for the prime reason to give people a space to be able to talk about what's on their heart and to believe them, whether or not it makes sense to us. That we really have to just start trusting each other and listening to each other. And anyway, obviously this is a passionate topic for me. And what you shared today, my goodness, I mean, I'm just like checking the boxes as you went down. I've spent my life trying to put this together, and, the dissertation is my effort. And what you and Danny are doing, I'm just so happy and so thrilled, that this is all coming to the forefront. And I guess the other thing I will say, literally with David Grouch coming forward, and this is just how life works when we're in the flow. I happened to be with Danny and Richard Dolan in California when that broke, and we all got to watch it together and hear the conversation. And again, sitting in the audience, here we are all these years later. And what Grouch went through was what my father went through. My father was 37 and Grouch is 37, 38. And, so I have a deep, intimate, cellular experience of what his wife went through, what his children were going through. And that's all these years later. And, that's just one example. And then, and I will say this too, and this is how in the hub of this I am. I grew up in Anne Arundel County. After we left Mountstrom, we came to Anne Arundel County. That's where NSA is. My father was stationed at NSA.
Mm.
And that's where Richard Snowden, he grew up in Anne Arundel County and NSA. So, I mean, for me, it's overwhelming how all these threads are coming together. But I'm just thrilled, that, and my passion for the rest of my life, I mean, I'm at an age to retire, but is to start healing this moral injury from the individual level and also collective. And I'll just take it one step further and then I'll be quiet because I could go on and on and on. But, we just had a mass shooting in Maine. And the man was a veteran. And while I'm watching that unfold, literally it happened on Wednesday. Monday, we had just been acknowledged as the safest state in the nation. Wednesday, we have the mass shooting. He was a veteran. And then meanwhile, we're mobilizing for 2 wars and we're sending in ground troops overseas. And I'm just like, talk about schizophrenic. Can't anybody see the schizophrenic culture that we live in? That we're panicking. So anyway, that's my ramble.
Well, no, I think you're making some seminal points, and I would underscore 2 things about what you've been saying is, everyone, what Linda lived through with her father and her family is indicative of what hundreds of people have lived through who've either, maybe more, who've either had experiences, and everybody who's ever reported a UFO experience has their lives completely changed. It's not something, well, maybe you had something on Saturday, but by next Tuesday you don't remember. Virtually everybody who has a UFO experience has a life-changing experience. And it's so real to them that can't be denied. And yet the culture says you're delusional. So the trauma that Linda went through and her father went through is significant. And some people don't survive the experience. And we need to just take that in as we're now navigating into this next phase. And then the second point is just really the opportunity that's now with us, given Lou Alessandro, given David Grush, given the different whistleblowers, given what Congress is doing. There's a momentum. And the extraordinary thing, and this is what I want to tease out, from a Jungian point of view, the perfection of this moment is exquisite. Right at the moment where we're literally about ready to take ourselves out. With climate change, with world war, it's unbelievable where the world is now convulsing with a momentum toward war, right as climate change is spinning out of control. People like the Maine mass shooter are freaking out, and we're being notified by the US government, essentially, that the ETs are here. We're not alone, which is providing humanity with the one narrative that, if we could embrace it,
Jim,
would allow us.
I could just interrupt with that. So the one comment, though, is that it's our more so than not. I mean, I think with the civilians, the not being believed is the issue and the insanity. But from a military and anybody that would report it to the military, it was the threat narrative and the paranoia that would emerge out of that.
Yeah.
And so it really, truly, and again, the Jungian is, and transpersonal is my passion, is that it really boils down to our relationship to power.
Yes.
And this is where the spiritual comes in, that can we align with a higher intelligence, that comes from within, and not be so paranoid and fearful of the external intelligences and how we have been conditioned to fear. and also seduced by
Yeah.
how to look away. I've mentioned before
Exactly.
when I talked, addiction is looking away, and how we've been conditioned to look away from the truth. And look at all the shiny objects, and that we're the most powerful nation, and that we're the most humanitarian, and none of it's true. So breaking through the denial, breaking through the lies, coming
Exactly.
into power. So
Exactly. And that's what we're trying to do. And so I really thank you, Linda. I want to also note Charles's point about volunteers. We've been kind of inundated with people who want to volunteer. We're in the process of organizing them. And probably over the next couple of weeks, as we get our director of operations in place and different aspects of our basic organizational infrastructure so that we can handle the volunteers, we'll be in touch with everybody, and probably we'll have some meetings because we want to honor everybody who wants to be involved, and because we see this as a people's movement. It's just that we're needing to get it together at the level of infrastructure in order to be able to honor the enthusiasm that we're meeting from people who want to volunteer. So, well, I think that'll probably take us to the outer limits of today, everyone. Linda, thank you so much for jumping in. I really appreciate it. And you'll be able to take Linda's course, hopefully starting in the new year from Ubiquity University as part of this larger new paradigm Ubiquity training program in ET studies. And we'll keep everybody posted on that. So you're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. You received the link in your Zoom invites. And then we'll see you all again tomorrow, where we'll have our 4th of 5 sessions on whistleblowers, this one from the corporate sector, with Jody Evans, who's been traveling today in China. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow.